We now start the second panel of this one-day conference. Let me say a couple of things as our other guests come back to the room. I am Duccio Mazzozzi and I teach History of International Relations at Ca' Foscari University in Venice, and I would like to thank the organizers of this conference for inviting me to discuss this second panel, particularly Alessandra Bitumi, who, besides being the main organizer, is also next to me as one of the panelists. This second panel offers us three interesting papers, kind of different in their contents, but unified by the period they deal with, which is the 1970s. Our first speaker is Alessandra Bitumi from the University of Bologna, who will give her paper on Atlantic interdependence and European integration, the search for balance in the 1970s. Then we will have Umberto Tulli, at the extreme left down there, with a paper entitled Switching Roles at Belgrade, the United States and the European Community at the First CSCE Follow-Up Meeting. And then we have Benedetto Zaccaria from the IMT in Lucca with a paper on the European Community's quest for a united and independent Yugoslavia between 1968 and 1980. The three speakers will speak for 15 minutes each, and I will give some short and possibly abrasive comment. And then we will have the chance for global discussion. I'll open the discussion to the floor. So our first speaker, Alessandra Bitumi, she received her PhD in European Integration History from the University of Pavia in 2011. She's currently a postdoctoral fellow at the University of Bologna and Jean Monnet adjunct professor here in Forlì. Atlantic interdependence and European integration, the search for a balance in the 1970s.
Thank you very much. I'll try with a microphone or no. Okay. So my contribution focuses on the complex coordination between the process of European integration and Atlanticism in the 70s, which is described by recent mainstream historiography as a decade of manifold crises. And it is indeed a decade of crisis also from a transatlantic perspective. I will not dwell on the single moments of tension between the United States and the European community and Western countries, nor I'll offer a detailed explanation of all the economic and political initiatives undertaken during the decade. Umberto in this panel will talk more extensively about the Conference on Security and Cooperation in Europe, and in the afternoon a reach session will debate the Middle East question. But I can clarify the projects I mentioned later, if you will. So in my 15 minutes, what I'll try to do is to articulate a more general and overarching discussion and discourse on the structural causes and consequences of the crisis of the Atlantic community. And I will begin with a sketchy presentation of the development of post-war transatlantic relations, and then move on to address the basic question of today's presentation. Was the crisis of the 70s different from the previous crisis? Was it peculiar? And if so, what were its significance and its legacy? So in the early years of the Cold War, one of the key elements of containment was a consistent U.S. encouragement of the process of European integration. Deputy Assistant Secretary for Atlantic Affairs, Ambassador Schetzel, claimed that American policy on European integration and the broad support this policy enjoyed in the United States was perhaps easier to define and to explain than almost any other aspect of their foreign policy. In a word, he said, the support rested on the solid basis of what we conceive to be enlightened American self-interest. So at first, U.S. officials unambiguously supported the first European cooperative undertakings, the European Coal and Steel Community, European Defense Community, and in a more reluctant mood, the European Common Market. But as soon as the process of continental unification progressed, U.S. attitudes became harsh. They hardened as early as 1958, as Alan Milward and Federico Romero have persuasively argued. But despite mounting reciprocal criticism, however, no major crisis shattered the foundations of the Atlantic community in the 70s, up until the 1960s actually. And this had much to do with the American stance on the Euro-American relationship. Political benefits still outweighed economic shortcomings, as well as with peculiar set of conditions in Western Europe. No serious political threat had come from the European community because no form of significant political unity had appeared yet. But beginning in 1969, members of the European community, both singularly and collectively, reorganized or at least attempted to reshape their approach to both Western affairs and international affairs, and their approach to the Cold War. And such a transformation in the European approach to international affairs ran parallel to the beginning of the U.S. transition to a new phase and form of hegemony, which was strikingly less centered on the Atlantic. And this combination, U.S. dominance transformation and European communities' quest for autonomy, produced an unrestrained and, in my view, unprecedented challenge to the Atlantic Compromise and to the Atlantic community, and progressively led to the demise of the Atlantic framework as it was interpreted and managed in the early years of the Cold War. So, the declining strength and validity of the Atlantic Compromise was both the cause and the consequences of the increased dynamism of the European community that progressively materialized, albeit in a vague and contradictory form, after the Hague Conference of 1969, which is considered a turning point in the history of the European integration process. Domestic as well as international forces triggered a significant change at the community level and allowed for the possibility of reconfiguring the aims of integration behind merely economic issues. The European community entered the 1970s with a renewed sense of direction that was best represented by the formula, by the so-called spirit of the Hague, which is encapsulated in the formula of deepening, completion, and enlargement. Results were contradictory. The European community's member states failed in meeting the challenge of political unification and responded disorderly or inefficiently to critical issues. As Daniel Mockley has shown in his remarkable study on the slow rise and quick fall of European political cooperation, the trajectory of the EPC was not straight and it was not long, as it basically eclipsed after 1975, nor the ambitious goal of monetary unification was reached within the decade. So overall, coordination proved shaky and ultimately weak in the foreign policy field, as in the monetary and economic domain, with the oil's burden that further complicated the negotiation of interests between the members of the European community. But nevertheless, remarkable achievements were made and should not be underestimated. Even skeptical analysis that labeled the period between 1973 and 1983 as a decade of stagnation, a stagnant decade, don't fail to appreciate its contribution to the enhancement of the process of European integration, which is more clearly understandable if we look and if we try and understand it in the long-term perspective. The substantial progress toward the unification of Europe, which would be achieved later between 1985 and 1992, was the result of an accumulation of long-planned strategies at different levels of the community, and most of them were rooted in the transformations of the 1970s and can be summarized in the expression of a Europe willing to speak with one voice. Against the background of a sound economic growth that measured in terms of GDP, average growth rate, trade, and development aid, proved the European community had caught up and sometimes overtaken the United States. Western European countries agreed to translate their economic prowess into political actorness, pursuing far-reaching initiatives and projects that would support a collective action in international affairs. So the European community participated as a single actor already in 1973 at the Conference on Security and Cooperation in Europe. Discussions on some European defense cooperation were undertaken, and the member states were actively engaged in the search for peace in the Middle East, issuing the 1973 November Declaration, which is a milestone in the European community and later European Union policy towards the Middle East area. And the Euro-Arab and North-South dialogue followed. Confronting Kissinger's strategy in the stabilization of Southern Europe, the European community and other Western European countries prevailed in negotiating an integrative solution that would act primarily through the inclusion of Spain and Portugal, as Davide mentioned earlier, within the system of Western European economic, political, and institutional interdependence, granting the countries of the European community membership to the EC. And this outward dynamism of the EC was sustained by a very early reflection over a specific and potentially exceptional European identity. It's by no accident that one of the first forms of European self-referential exceptionalism appeared as early as 1972, when François Duchesne referred for the first time to Europe's role in the world as a civilian power. And a year later, so in 1973, prompted by Kissinger's failed call for a new Atlantic Charter, the member states elaborated a declaration on the common identity. An identity needs alterity if it is to be formed at all, and comparisons are encouraged in emphasizing each other's uniqueness. And in this context, the United States served as a counter-image with an identity-creating function for Europe herself. Politically, the rising European consciousness included opposition to the American hegemony and is translated into a contestation of the limited European role within the Atlantic community, whose pillars eroded as U.S. power entered into a new phase of crisis, and decline. From the outset, a crucial underpin of the long-lasting Pax Americana, as it was called, had been the U.S. ability to project what Charles Mayer defines as U.S. consensual hegemony that was constrained in a set of arrangements that limited American dominance while granting U.S. allies some room for autonomy by accommodating their basic needs. But U.S. dominance required, among other things, the willingness of its allies to cooperate. And this could be no more taken for granted if in the aftermath of World War II, Europe had invited the American empire as according to the famous Lundestad formula, the invitation was now much more selective. The first pillar to erode was American economic hegemony, which was traditionally embodied in Fordist mass production, technological innovation, unmatched productivity, and the strength of the dollar. And all of the above waned or vanished in the course of the 70s. By the 1970s, Fordism was declining across the Atlantic world. Across the Ruhr, mines and mills shut down, British mining, Detroit car manufacturing, Pittsburgh steel all suffered from deindustrialization. And Rust Belt entered the vocabulary. The shape of post-industrial and post-Fordist economy was not yet clear in the 1970s, but the crisis of traditional source of growth and innovation was manifest. And the exhaustion of Fordism was matched by the eventual discovery of Keynes, of the ineffectuality of Keynes' theories and practices. The American share of world trade declined by 23% in the 1970s. The US dropped from first to fifth in standard of living rankings. And in 1971, for the first time, the US ran its first balance of trade deficit. The American perception of its relative economic decline generated a sense of crisis and loss of confidence, which was exacerbated by US military and political difficulties that reverberated in the Transatlantic Relationship. As Peter Patterson, U.S. Special Envoy to the European Community, claimed, for 25 years we have helped these European bastards getting back on their feet, and now they take us for a ride. So easy policy were under attack. Common agricultural policy, bilateral trade agreements with countries other than the Europeans. And transatlantic economic tensions coupled with growing monetary discomfort, while with the dollar losing credibility and Bretton Woods system coming to an end, one of the main pillars of U.S. Hegemony collapsed, and the EC attempted to react with the creation of the snake, a currency joint float mechanism that failed but paved the way for the slow process of monetary unification that eventually took place decades later. The economic crisis of the 70s steered the debate over the limits of Keynesianism and opened up room for the ascendance of neoliberalism. Though with the creation of the G7, leading economies agreed together and discussed common problems, developing common policies proved much more difficult. And as the US rejected the 1974 call by the G77 and the UN for the new international economic order that would give the global South a greater voice in the International Monetary Fund and World Bank, Western Europeans were more inclined to foster North-South dialogue and development aid. And even domestically, the US turned away from Keynesianism much more rapidly than the members of the European community that were still committed to defending the post-war social project. So it seemed that a transatlantic social policy gap was widening, and the distance made the identity discourse that started revolving around the opposition between the European social model and the European vision of society and economy stronger. The second element that had buttressed US power and cemented the alliance was American unchanged military might, both conventional and nuclear, but the signing of SALT I and ABM Treaty, so namely the institutionalization of the strategy of deterrence, and the almost attained strategic parity between the superpowers seemed to dismantle, or at least to severely challenge, the very premise upon which the transatlantic architecture was built. And lastly, the rhetoric of Atlanticism, the language of the Atlantic community, was becoming less and less binding. The contestation of American hegemony was manifold, and it materialized not only in conflicts over economic and strategic issues, but it translated into open hostility to U.S. politics and culture. The U.S. ability to project its model overseas and maintain its dominance by consent was also based on the pervasive power to generate consensus on multiple levels, and that was being challenged in unprecedented ways and intensity over the course of the decade. Reports on public opinion reveal a sharp decline in Western Europeans' Atlanticism. If we take West Germany, for example, which was one of the most Atlanticist countries in the EC, the drop was from 77% in the early 1965 to 11% 2 years later. And as the U.S. soft power ability diminished, also greatly influenced by the war in Vietnam and the racial question, the Atlantic divide became wider. So to conclude, 2 minutes, the crisis of the 1970s did not witness the abrupt end of the American century in Europe, but it did see the erosion of its hegemonic form, as well as the emergence of the European community's political challenge to the Atlantic Compromise. Moments of confrontation between the allies were numerous throughout the decade, but they did not lead to any unsolvable or intractable question. Unhinged as it was, the alliance survived the turmoil of the decade. But in my opinion, what permanently eroded was the original idea of the ultimate coincidence of interest between the two sides of the Atlantic, from which descended the traditional U.S. supported policy towards European integration. So the structural dilemma between the full compatibility between Atlantic design and the success of the European integration process, not only from an economic point of view and perspective, but also more importantly from a political point of view, fully unfolded in the 70s, making the crisis with this regard, somehow different and peculiar in the sense that it led to a rethinking of the Atlantic Compromise that survived the decade, and some argue that survived even the end of the Cold War, but it came out transformed in its very premises. The enduring negotiation effort that had characterized the making of the consensual Atlantic order became all the more complex as Europe gradually lost its prominence in US foreign policy, and Europe itself struggled to define its international identity. Thank you.
Okay, thanks to Alessandra, not only for her very interesting paper, but also for abiding by the 15 minutes perfectly. So I now leave the mic to Umberto Tulli from the University of Bologna. Umberto received his PhD in History and International Relations from the Istituto Italiano di Scienze Umane, and he's now a postdoctoral fellow at the University of Bologna, where he deals with US foreign policy in the 1970s, the Olympic movement in world history, and the rise of human rights in international relations. He's now given a paper on switching roles at Belgrade, the United States, and the European community at the first CSCE follow-up meeting. Umberto.
Thank you, Lucio. I think I have to thank Alessandra at least for 3 different reasons. The first one, obviously, is the fact that she organized this conference. The second one is that she offered me the opportunity to discuss a work in progress, and this is probably the first opportunity I have to discuss this paper. The third one is the fact that she introduced a general framework about the crisis of the 70s in transatlantic relations, and with this paper and with this talk I will try to go deepen on a peculiar aspect of the 70s and of the difficulties that emerged in the relations between the two shores of the Atlantic, namely the rise of human rights in international politics and how this international, transnational attention toward human rights modified and created 2 different conceptions of detente, an American conception of detente and a European community's conception of detente. To do that, I will focus on the early phase of the so-called Helsinki process, namely the Conference of Helsinki with the creation of the Conference on Security and Cooperation in Europe in August 1975, and the first follow-up conference, which was held in Belgrade between October 1977 and March 1978. I will focus especially on the different perceptions that the United States and the European community had of these 2 conferences. I will underline how their positions, their approaches, their priorities to some extent switched their roles, as I wrote in the title and Lucio just recalled, and I will try to offer some possible explanations for this change. So, a few words on the Helsinki negotiations and the Helsinki agreements. The Helsinki negotiations among the United States, all the European countries with the exception of Albania and the Soviet Union began in the early 70s after several proposals from the Soviet Union and its allies, and since the beginning the United States showed a certain neglect toward this multilateral process, because both President Nixon and Secretary and National Security Advisor Henry Kissinger preferred bilateral contacts to deal with the Soviet Union, but also because both of them have different priorities in foreign affairs, such as the Vietnam War or the arms control negotiations with the Soviet Union, but also because especially Kissinger considered the conference as a sort of sideshow for a reality which already was existing in Europe about the division of Europe. However, the American administration identified 2 priorities within the Helsinki negotiations. The first one was consistent with detente and with Kissinger's ideas about linkage. By the decision to participate in this conference, the United States were trying to obtain Soviet cooperation in other negotiations, in other priorities. A second aim of the United States was at giving a sense of priority of American primacy within the Atlantic community in a moment in which transatlantic relations, as Alessandra said a few minutes ago, were under several stress and pressures and were facing several problems. So, both in the transatlantic dimension and in the bipolar dimension of the American approach to the Conference on Security and Cooperation in Europe, that conference was not a priority, but more important, it had a conservative aim. It was aimed at redefining containment of Soviet power with other means, and on the other side, it was aimed at re-establishing the American primacy within the Western Alliance. Given the American disregard toward this conference, toward these negotiations, the European allies, and especially the European community, took front stage in dealing with the Soviet Union and the Warsaw Pact. This was consistent with the definition between 1969 and 1970 of the European political cooperation and the attempt to define a common foreign policy. And within these negotiations, the European community played a major role because it was able to speak and to act with a single European voice, with a strong coordination among the 6 and then the 9 members of the European community, but also because it was able to introduce some peculiar provisions and measures which defined a different conception of detente. According to the European perspective, detente was not a conservative politics. Rather, it was a dynamic and transformative process which final aim was at transforming the Cold War in Europe. The final aim was at improving, increasing, deepening the contacts between the two Europes through some provisions which were then in the second and third baskets of the Helsinki agreements, which dealt with economic, commercial, human and cultural contacts. So, to simplify, in August 1975, when the Helsinki agreements were signed, the European community had been actively pushing an active role and an increase in contacts between East and West, while the United States had showed a dismissive attitude toward the entire Conference on Security and Cooperation in Europe, and especially toward the third basket, the human rights provisions. In 1975, especially in the United States, the signing of these agreements was harshly criticized by the domestic public, by human rights NGOs, by the so-called ethnic lobbies, and especially by some conservative and neoconservative politicians. According to them, the Helsinki agreements, as well as the entire process of detente, was a one-way street which created advantages and benefits just for the Soviets, which it was a new form of appeasement, and despite the norms and the provisions on human rights, well, there was no tool to oblige, to urge the Soviets to respect such norms. But the Helsinki agreements had a different effect. They became a sort of international vehicle for the activities, the petitions, the protests of Soviet dissidents in the communist world, which began to urge, to demand Soviet government to respect the norms that the government had agreed on a few months before. This activism in the Soviet Union and in Eastern European countries was mirrored in Western Europe and in the United States. A transnational movement which urged the respect of the third basket of the human rights provisions of the Helsinki agreements emerged in Western countries. And between 1975 and 1976, it was particularly effective in American domestic politics. In 1976, the American Congress created a congressional commission to monitor the implementation and the respect of the Helsinki agreements in all the signatory countries. It was a blatant violations of the Helsinki agreements because it was against the non-interference principle which was solemnly proclaimed by the agreement. But the creation of such a body demonstrated that in the US political debate it was emerging a new conception of the Helsinki agreements. They were no more perceived as the ultimate victory of the Soviet Union, but they began to be perceived as a tool to promote human rights in Eastern Europe. A second consequence was the election to the White House of Jimmy Carter. Jimmy Carter, during the last months of the electoral campaign, started to emphasize human rights, especially in bipolar relations. He defined human rights as a fundamental pillar of American foreign policy. Of course, as soon as Carter entered the White House, he began to discuss human rights and Soviet violations of human rights. He provoked a firm reaction from the Soviet Union and some criticism from Western European governments. In 1977, it was scheduled a conference to review the implementation of the Helsinki agreements, and toward this conference, the United States began to emphasize over and over again Soviet violations of human rights, while Western European countries began to define a common position which was prioritizing the second basket, the economic cooperation, over the third basket, human rights provisions. European positions reflected two major problems. On the one side, these European countries and the European community saw the American firmness on Soviet violations of human rights as a threat to their intra-European detente, a threat to this process which was aimed at reconciling the two Europes. But on the other one, Carter's firmness on human rights created enough room within European Western countries for the oppositions, the political oppositions, to criticize their government's foreign policy. It was the case of Italy, where the Italian Socialist Party was playing the card of Soviet dissidents and Soviet violations of human rights to criticize the compromesso storico. But it was also the case of the Great Britain, where the Conservative Party criticized the Labour's government because of the perceived lack of a human rights policy. And it was the case of the Western Germany, where the CDU-CSU criticized the government for its dialogue with Eastern Germany. So, between February and March, Western European criticism was matched by the definition of a common political, of a common position toward the Belgrade Conference, which was aimed at reaching three main objectives. The first one was the reinforcement, the strengthening of this intra-European dialogue, and so at giving priority to economic cooperation over human rights confrontation. The second aim was the promotion of the cohesion of the European community, and eventually at reaching diplomatic recognition from the Soviet Union for the European community. The third aim was at defining some new provisions for the strengthening of the implementation of the Helsinki agreements. I will cut a large part of my presentation because I think
You have 1 minute.
I have 1 minute. So the conference opened in October 1977. After 2 weeks of dialogue among the participants, the United States began to openly criticize and challenge the Soviet Union for its violations of human rights. Western European countries criticized the American approach to the conference, and the conference entered a deadlock. After some unfruitful negotiations in which the European community tried to propose new provisions to strengthen detente, Western diplomats accepted the Soviet proposal for the concluding document, which failed to mention human rights and the third basket. So, the conference was perceived as a total and complete failure. So, long story short, the Belgrade negotiations and the final document were perceived as a failure because they failed to mention, to discuss human rights, they failed to openly criticize the Soviet Union for its violations of human rights, and because it created new tensions between the United States and Western Europe. However, what I'm trying to demonstrate, what I'm trying to study, is the fact that despite the deadlock in the negotiations and the erosion of bipolar detente, the conference had some positive effects. The first one was that it legitimized human rights in bipolar relations and in East-West negotiations and talks. The second one is that despite some difficulties both within the European community and between the European community and the United States, the European community maintained a certain degree of unity, of cohesion, and it reinforced its conception of intra-European detente as a transformative process. Thank you.
Okay, thank you to Umberto. Paper. And now we have our third speaker, Benedetto Zaccaria. He is a PhD candidate at the IMT in Lucca. He has a BA and an MA from the University of Padova, and in 2013, spring 2013 was...
Yes, just
that's
the last month.
Okay, good, wonderful. He's been a visiting research student at the London School of Economics Ideas Center. He will give his presentation on the European Community's quest for a united and independent Yugoslavia between 1968 and 1980.
Thank you. And thank you, Alessandra, first for your invitation to the conference. Well, my paper, as you know, will focus on the policy carried out by the European Community during the 1970s in order to strengthen Yugoslavia's integrity and independence. And I will concentrate on the policy carried out by the European institution, the European Commission in particular. And I will contextualize this policy in the broader frameworks of the Cold War and of the European integration process. I am well aware that talking about Western attempts to preserve Yugoslavia's unity and independence may sound like a provocation, especially if one considers Western failed attempts to preserve stability in Yugoslavia in the early 1990s. And to this regard, several scholars have argued that during the late Cold War years, Yugoslavia was nothing more than a simple trading partner, and that Western policymakers were unaware of Yugoslavia's fragile internal and external situation. This view has not been confuted by the Cold War historiography, which has mainly concentrated on relations between the Western Bloc and Yugoslavia in the early Cold War years. and also recent studies focusing on Western European policy aiming at promoting stability in the Mediterranean region during the 1970s have addressed the Yugoslav case only marginally. On the contrary, the goal of my paper and the goal of my research is to show that in the 1970s the search for a stable, united and independent Yugoslavia was one of the great external challenges for the European community. My presentation is based on two main questions, which I will try to answer in my conclusion. The first was why during the 1970s the EC struggled for Yugoslavia's unity and independence. The second is why the 9 EC members decided to deploy a coordinated policy towards Yugoslavia within the framework of the community. In the first part of my presentation, I will focus on EC-Yugoslav relations from 1968 to 1975, that is during the years of international detente. The first community policy towards Yugoslavia goes back to October 1968, when, as was said during the first panel, the EC Commission entered into trade negotiations with Belgrade in the aftermath of Soviet invasion in Prague, which was regarded by the 6 EC members as a potential threat to Yugoslavia. EC's countries wanted in particular to strengthen economic ties with Belgrade to demonstrate their interest in a stable and independent Yugoslavia. The signing of the first trade agreements in March 1970 represented a symbolic landmark in the process of European integration, also for two reasons. The first is that the EC-Yugoslav agreement was the first trade agreement to be directly negotiated by the EC Commission under the provisions of the Common Commercial Policy, which had entered into force on January 1st, 1970. The second is that the EC took advantage of the new relationship with Belgrade to relaunch its image among the non-aligned and developing countries. And this was clearly in line with the decision taken at the summit of The Hague in December 1969 to impose the community as a relevant international actor with a well-defined identity. And the president of the EC Commission, Pierre Armel, defined the non-preferential trade agreement with Yugoslavia as the best answer to the opposition demonstrated by a number of countries against EC's commercial policy. These views were reiterated when the next president of the EC Commission, Franco Maria Malfatti, visited Tito in June 1971. In that circumstance, Malfatti stressed the new course of the EC as an open community with a deep concern for the problem of her partners. And he highlighted the value of the EC's generalized system of preferences to all developing countries, which had been launched by the community a few months before. Malfatti also emphasized the EC views on the ongoing process of European detente, which suited Yugoslavia's non-alignment well. Malfatti stressed, and I quote, "We do not want to be a bloc. We want to overcome the strict and sterile logic of the blocs." End of quote. The common goal of a genuinely European detente was eventually emphasized by the cooperation between the EC9 and the neutral and non-aligned countries during the Conference on Security and Cooperation in Europe. However, in the early 1970s, EC-Yugoslav relations were affected by the stagnation of bilateral trade because of the protectionist measures urged by several EC member states in the aftermath of the 1973 oil shock. In my view, the real turning point in EC-Yugoslav relation is to be located in 1976. It corresponded to the decline of the process of international detente, which implied the resurgence of Western fears of a Soviet grand design on the global stage, which included also the Mediterranean region. In fact, since the late 1960s, NATO military experts had been discussing potential Soviet plans to regain position in the Mediterranean region. And in this context, Yugoslavia was seen as a weak partner for the following reasons. The first was the strategic and appealing position of Yugoslav ports in Croatia and Montenegro. The second was the mounting crisis of Yugoslavia's role within the non-aligned movement and the emergence of a pro-Soviet faction within the movement headed by Cuba. The third element, why Yugoslavia was seen as a weak NATO's partner, was the alarming perspective for the post-Tito era. Most analyses elaborated in Western embassies in Belgrade about the question, after Tito, what? depicted disquieting scenarios for Yugoslavia's future. Of course, the direct military intervention of the Soviet Union in Yugoslavia was considered to be unlikely. But Moscow was considered interested in favoring the emergence of pro-Soviet forces in Yugoslavia, able to exploit inter-republican rivalries to weaken the Balkan state unity. All these concerns became particularly evident when Brezhnev visited Belgrade in November 1976 and asked Tito the free entry of Soviet warship in the Yugoslav harbors. In the mid-1970s, within the NATO and community frameworks, the question was how to manage the rise of Soviet pressure towards Yugoslavia. Within NATO, military experts agreed that the North Atlantic Alliance should not be involved in the Yugoslav issue, because any attempt to formally declare NATO's interest and engagement in Yugoslav affairs could offer the Soviet Union a pretext to intervene in turn in Yugoslav affairs. But, differently from NATO, the European community had the right competencies in the commercial field and, above all, the political discretion to strengthen Western links to Yugoslavia. In particular, thanks to its newly acquired competence in the commercial field, the EC Commission could establish contacts with Belgrade in a low-profile way, that is, by respecting Yugoslavia's non-aligned nature. This is why, from the mid-1970s, EC and Yugoslav officials discussed several times the need to strengthen bilateral relations in the perspective of the post-Tito era. The dialogue led to a series of concrete achievements. The first was a joint statement signed in December 1976 between the EC and Yugoslavia, which defined Yugoslavia as a European, Mediterranean and non-aligned country. Even if you read this statement, it may appear just a mere declaration of interest of the two parties to strengthen economic cooperation, it had in fact strong political foundations, which regarded the fear of Soviet influence in the Balkans and the Mediterranean basin, and second, the protection of Yugoslavia's stability and international independence in the post-Tito era. And it is interesting here to note that the EC acted as a tool for the Western Bloc as a whole, since in several meetings between EC countries and US representatives, it was agreed that it was the EC that should strengthen Western links with Yugoslavia. The second achievement was the decision to include Yugoslavia within the global Mediterranean policy, which had been launched by the EC in 1972, to strengthen links with several countries of the Mediterranean region. Indeed, the main problem during the first round of negotiation in 1978 with Yugoslavia was that Yugoslavia wanted to negotiate just a non-preferential agreement, since the entry of Yugoslavia in a preferential zone would have cut across the Yugoslav policy of strict non-alignment. However, this will of Yugoslavia to negotiate a non-preferential approach had great limitations, since all non-preferential trade concessions given to Yugoslavia could be automatically extended, according to the GATT rules, to all EC trade partners, and this was clearly against the Nine's economic interests. The impasse was overcome in June 1978 when the EC Commissioner Wilhelm Haferkamp proposed his Yugoslav counterparts to negotiate a cooperation agreement envisaging a preferential trade system within the framework of EC's global Mediterranean policy. This proposal, which was accepted by Yugoslavia, would benefit EC-Yugoslav relations for several reasons. First, it would offer a legal background for the reduction of EC barriers to Yugoslavia's exports on the basis of other agreements already concluded by the EC with other Mediterranean countries. Second, it would pave the way for bilateral cooperation in several economic fields, including the financial one through the action of the European Bank of Investment. Third, from a political viewpoint, it would represent a step forward towards the policy of EC rapprochement to Yugoslavia in the perspective of the post-Tito era. The proposal advanced by Haferkamp was unanimously accepted by the Nine, who recognized that behind the facade of economic negotiation there was the issue of Yugoslavia's future integrity, which had to be sustained by the community. However, negotiations between EC and Yugoslavia were not carried out in an easy way. On the one hand, the EC9 were reluctant to grant several Yugoslav products access to the EC market. On the other hand, Yugoslavia was concerned because of deterioration of relations with the USSR, crisis within the non-aligned movement. And there is archival evidence from community archives that Yugoslavia's efforts to strengthen its role among the non-aligned and developing countries within the G77 strongly affected the negotiation with the community. The turning point in EC-Yugoslav relations was the Soviet invasion in Afghanistan. This event indeed nourished Western suspicions of some Soviet scheme that might include other countries, including Yugoslavia. Soviet intervention in Afghanistan accelerated negotiations between the EC and Yugoslavia, which were once again conducted in a very low-profile way. Accordingly, the EC Commission urged the European Parliament not to debate political relations between the EC and Yugoslavia, and these relations should be absolutely not appear as a Western plan to include Yugoslavia into the Western sphere of influence. Negotiation ended in April 1980 when a cooperation agreement was signed. The agreement established a preferential and non-reciprocal trade system and set up new mechanisms of economic cooperation, including finance. So, at the dawn of the 1980s, both the EC and Yugoslavia depicted this cooperation agreement as a milestone for future relations. The Yugoslav representatives stressed the importance of having achieved a contractual link with the community which formally respected Belgrade's autonomy and offered guarantees for Yugoslavia's economic stability. For the nine, the agreement symbolized the EC's support to Yugoslavia's stability in the perspective of the post-Tito era. And at the same time, it preserved Yugoslavia's non-aligned stance. Coming to the conclusion, I think it's now time to answer the two questions I addressed at the beginning of my presentation. The first one was why during the 1970s EC struggled for Yugoslavia's unity and independence. My answer to this question is that EC's policy towards Yugoslavia was motivated by the need to prevent the expansion of Soviet influence in the Mediterranean arena. And this is why I argue that the Yugoslav case should be studied within the broader framework of Western European struggle to stabilize the Mediterranean through economic means. The second question was why the 9 EC members decided to deploy a coordinated policy towards Yugoslavia within the framework of the community. My answer is that thanks to its competencies in the commercial sphere, the EC Commission could act as a porte-parole of the 9 and strengthen links between Western Europe and Yugoslavia in a low-profile way. And this was the best way, according to the 9, to avoid any risk of Soviet countermoves in the Balkans in the years to come. My paper has therefore highlighted, at least I hope, how the Cold War framework affected and constrained the development of further political relations, for instance an association agreement between the EC and Yugoslavia. Indeed, any sign of Western direct interference in Yugoslavia's internal affairs could have altered the status quo in Europe and at the same time weakened Yugoslavia's already fragile and internal and external stance. Thank you for your attention.
Okay, thank you also Benedetto for this very interesting paper. We now have
20 minutes.
roughly 20 minutes, of which I think my comments will cover at least 19. And then yeah, that's good. That's wonderful. Now, as a general comment, I wish to stress that all the three papers were interesting, well-written, well-documented, carrying multi-archival research, very informative. So they're all worth reading. Okay. We agreed before panel that, however, in order to make the discussion possibly more interesting for all of us, I would focus on the criticism that is possible to make about the three papers. And there's not much criticism that can be done about what the papers actually say, okay? What each paper actually says. So in order to criticize them, I have rather to focus on what they do not say, okay? And I hope this is also useful from a methodological standpoint. What do I mean? Alessandra you talk about the 1970s, transatlantic relations in the 1970s. The 1970s, it's just a conventional thing that we use in order to organize our conception of time. Okay, but politically, there's nothing that defines the 1970s as such. Okay, so why focusing on the 1970s as a meaningful time frame to develop your work? And in fact, you speak about the 1970s, but it seems to me that you focus much of your work on the years between possibly 1968 and 1974. Okay, which I absolutely agree with. It can be defined in many ways a time of crisis in the Atlantic relationship. But you don't consider, for example, the years between 75 and 77, which have been described recently by Pierce Ludlow as a renewal of U.S. hegemony and leadership. And then we should possibly speak of another time of crisis at the end of the decade, with 1978, 1979, but in a very different way as compared to the early 1970s, because while a lot of people in Europe seems to dislike what Jimmy Carter is doing in the United States, but at the same time, they do not really put in place anything substantial in order to counter what the U.S. is doing. At least I don't see, besides the rhetoric, I don't see the EMS as challenging the supremacy of the U.S. dollar. And then I'll say something else about this as I come to comment on Benedetto's paper. Umberto, two things. You seem to take for granted that the Belgrade meeting was important. Okay, was important. And how do you demonstrate that it was important? Important as compared to what? If I think of 1978 in Italy, or in many ways in the rest of Western Europe and the United States, I think of Aldo Moro's kidnapping, I think of political crises more or less everywhere, I think of stagflation, I think of so many issues that were more prominent than Belgrade, that I would like to know how you say that it did matter. And on the other hand, I always believe that a definition of human rights is necessary when we speak about these things. You take for granted that the Soviet Union was the author of massive violations of human rights, which I think can be taken for granted in many ways, but I think that these should be defined better. And I want to know why human rights issues came to play a role, according to what you say, in the Soviet sphere of influence, but apparently they were not so relevant in Northern Ireland, or they were not so relevant in Italy. 1977 was a year of massive violations of human rights in Italy. I think we had like 500 political prisoners. 4 days ago, it was the anniversary of the murder of Giuliana Laschi. And Giuliana Laschi was just the last of a leftist demonstrator assassinated by the police in Italy. And we could add Francesco Lorusso, and only to keep in 1977. So why human rights had a role on one side of the Iron Curtain, but apparently they were not so relevant on this side of the Iron Curtain. And finally, Benedetto, at the beginning of your paper, you define the European community as the leading actor in negotiation. I appreciated your paper a lot, but with one point that again should be defined better. What makes a leading actor? Okay, how do you define what a leading actor is? And can't this the use of leading actor applied to the European community be deemed in many ways contradictory with other things that you write in your paper? There's one point, and you also stressed it in your presentation, where you say that basically Kissinger said, okay, let's use the European community as the main vehicle to deal with Yugoslavia. If this is what you write and what you say, I would say that Kissinger is the leading actor and the European community is an instrument. Okay, which leads me to one general question. Okay, which I think is also in line with the title of the overall conference. Did the European community matter after all? Alessandra, from your paper, I gather that the European community mattered, but basically as an object, as a process. It was there, but it's not, again, it's not an actor. Okay, Umberto, from your paper, I gather that the European community matters, but basically as the environment in which the national governments, the 9, worked to do something else. Okay, from what you say, and with my previous criticism in mind, you seem to say, no, the European community was an actor in itself. Okay. Finally, your work. You never mentioned the Belgrade Conference.
Yeah.
Okay. So, again, was the Belgrade Conference important or not? Because if your work that speaks intensively about the relations between the West Europeans and Yugoslavia doesn't mention it, I would tend to conclude that it was not that relevant. Mm-hmm. Okay? And again, your work, you represent Kissinger and the national governments and to a certain extent the EC Commission as deciding together the line to keep towards Yugoslavia. So, how does this match with Alessandra's position that tends to define the 1970s as a period of relative worsening and not so good cooperation and ultimately crisis between the two shores of the Atlantic?
Great.
Thank you, Jerry.
Would you like to answer these questions first, or should we collect further questions? Maybe.
You prefer,
raccogliamo altre domande se ce ne sono. Okay. Well, you guys think to further questions.
Should I start? Yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you, Duce, for your interesting comments. Why the 70s? I'll begin with that. I understand your critique towards the decadological approach. I mean, the 70s are just a decade as the 60s were, the 50s were. And definitely the limits are greater if we emphasize continuity over rupture in historical analysis. But in my view, and I'm not original, I mean, we're authors, and I'm thinking of the authors of The Shock of the Global, the 1970s, believe that they are different and they matter as a unit, even if we consider them in a longer perspective, the long 1970s, which began actually in 1968, because structural changes and transformations began materializing in that decade. The post-war order started collapsing, or or in the 1970s, globalization began in the 1970s. Non-state actors became prominent, and transnational issues such as environmentalism, human rights, they started gaining unprecedented attention. So I believe that the decade it's important, it makes sense to consider it as a turning point in international history and in transatlantic relations history, because roots of structural changes can be found in those 12 years span time. I believe it's a decade of crisis, although I read last paper by Ludlow on Ford administration between 1975 and 1977, but it's really short parenthesis, which was good, especially if we compare it with what came before Nixon and what came after Carter. But all in all, I believe that the decade was pretty much a decade of strain in the Atlantic Alliance. And after they say why they believe it's a positive period, I can say why I rather believe that the EC basically failed, at least in those 10 years. There was an attempt, definitely, and that's the positive thing that I would underline. There was a renewed attention towards, new attention towards the international dimensions, and it struggled to gain space and attention, but yeah, I would not say that was a success, at least the initiatives that we mentioned.
Was Belgrade important? The answer depends on the perspective. If we accept the idea that the Helsinki process was important to understand the last 10, 15 years of the Cold War, the Belgrade Conference was fundamental because of Soviet dissidents' tensions toward the conference, because of the intra-European detente, because it was the last meeting in detente. And what you have said, talking about the Afghanistan, probably demonstrates this point. After the invasion of Afghanistan, the two major legacies of Belgrade continued, namely the attention toward human rights in East-West relations and the attempt to develop an intra-European transformative detente. Probably this is the major difference between the United States and the European community, Western Europe, after 1979. Second question, the lack of a definition of human rights. That's true, and this is a problem with which I'm struggling since I started to work on the Carter administration and the rise of human rights. This is in part a consequence of the fact that the Carter administration tried to give a global, holistic definition of human rights, but at the end of the day, what the Carter administration was referring to was a Western conception of human rights, fundamental freedoms, while economic and cultural rights were less important. And this difference probably could be used as an answer to your third question, why human rights violations in the Soviet Union are crucial while other human rights violations are not so important. By the way, in 1977, Amnesty International received the Nobel Prize for Peace, and Amnesty International was probably the first, if not only the only, human rights NGOs to discuss human rights outside of the Cold War perspective. So human rights as a global concern began in this moment, but the issue, the political debate, was about Soviet violations of human rights. Human rights violation in the communist world. Did the European community matter? I think that you touched my main point, that at least in 1977, at least toward the Belgrade Conference, the European community was facing a moment of difficulties in the definition of the European political cooperation. After the success of the Helsinki Conference in 1977, states were acting through the European framework, the European Community framework, to define, to give priority to their national interests.
Okay. Thank you. Melandri.
So very shortly, the first question was what does leading actor means, in which sense? I mean that the persons, the officials who physically negotiated with the Yugoslavs were officials of the European Commission. In this sense, a lot of bilateral meetings took place in which Cold War issues were discussed, not only trade matters but high politics. And also in bilateral meetings with the representatives of the EC member states, one of the points in discussion was always relations with the EC, one of the main points in discussion. So in this sense, the EC is always present and physically negotiates with the Yugoslavs. The second instrument, the EC was an instrument or an actor in itself. I think that the United States recognized that the EC was the only actor that could manage the Yugoslav issue, and through, as I said, a low-profile way, because every open declaration to support Yugoslavia would weaken Yugoslavia, because it would give the USSR a pretext to intervene in turn Yugoslavia affairs. And as a Yugoslav representative once said to a French diplomat, the US is important, but it is far. So you are close to us, so it's up to you. The third, another point was about transatlantic relationship during the 70s. I think that some topics could be negotiated, some topics could be discussed, but when there was a priority for the West as a whole, then the US and the European position combined. Maybe this could be an answer to this question. The last one about the Belgrade conference. It was important, and I should have mentioned, of course, because Belgrade was chosen as the seat of the follow-up meeting as a recognition of the importance of Yugoslavia, also during the Helsinki negotiations, because the non-aligned and neutral countries for the first time managed to play a rather important role during the Helsinki meeting. So it was a demonstration that Yugoslavia was an important country, and it was a French initiative, the one to choose Belgrade as the place where the follow-up meeting should be held. I think it was during the Belgrade conference there was more dialogue between the superpowers than between the European allies and Yugoslavia. So in this sense, this did not change or did not mark a turning point in relations between the West and Yugoslavia.
Okay, thank you. Much food for thought. Do you guys have any other questions?
One question for Benedetto. Concerning the agreement between the European communities and Yugoslavia, this was in the framework of cooperation agreements which were negotiated in the same years with mostly southern Mediterranean countries. How does the fact that Yugoslavia was instead both a Mediterranean and a European country, so somehow more similar to Greece and Turkey, which had negotiated agreements 15, 20 years before, change the shape of the agreement? Was there some kind of difference in the agreement with Yugoslavia than in those with other Mediterranean countries, by the fact that it was a European state, so in principle one day with an accession perspective? Thanks.
If I may add just, it's a comment or a suggestion, which kind of replies also to what Lucio was saying about what happened if something is different in the 1970s. Obviously, many things are different. But what I would do, at least now, if I wrote about Euro-Atlantic relationship in the 1970s or about the role of the European community in Yugoslavia, I would never start from the 1970s. You don't understand, you don't recognize the difference of what's new in the 1970s if you don't start from what was happening in the 50s or the 60s. The European community was viewed in the communist world only as a tool of international capitalism. So the very fact that the European community in some countries was recognized as something different than simply a tool of international capitalism at the service of the interests of the US is a big difference. But you don't recognize this if you don't start from after World War II. If you don't trace the changement in time.
Faccio in italiano. Allora, la mia domanda era, diciamo, globale. Se gli anni 70 possono essere considerati, a un certo punto di vista, tutto un periodo di un nuovo attivismo europeo sulla scena internazionale, considerando, partendo dal 69 con la Conferenze dell'Aia, quindi diciamo un nuovo spirito europeo, la fine di certe visioni nazionaliste come quelle di De Gaulle e diciamo il processo di distensione hanno portato a creare una rete di relazioni, una rete dell'Europa di relazioni internazionali verso, diciamo, buona parte del mondo, verso il blocco comunista e la conferenza di Helsinki per quanto riguarda appunto la conferenza di Helsinki, quindi diciamo un attivismo europeo verso quel senso. Un attivismo europeo verso il Medio Oriente con la crisi del 73 e quindi lo scontro anche dalla visione europea e americana e anche diciamo, l'attrazione del modello europeo, della comunità europea verso i paesi continentali, Spagna, Portogallo e Grecia, e anche nelle relazioni con la Jugoslavia da quel punto di vista. Quindi diciamo gli anni 70 come una rete capillare di relazioni europee che andarono poi a scontrarsi un po' con la visione americana, che forse vedeva ancora questo attivismo europeo, perché gli americani vedevano più che altro una relazione bipolare e monolitica del contesto internazionale.
L'ultima domanda.
All of us know what happened in the early 90s when Germany largely supported the independence of Croatia. I'm curious about the fact if in the 70s there was confrontation between the member states of the European Union about the integrity, the independence of Yugoslavia. If, in particular, Germany expressed some of the doubts about Yugoslavia. And I have a question for Alessandra. I have a doubt. I have studied the 70s for many years, and I have a doubt about the European Union, about the European community in the 70s. How much was ambitious the European Union? In this sense, do you think that the European Union in the 70s was searching for a rule of hegemony in the world? It was, if the European Union wanted to challenge the United States at global level, wanted to, in a sense, substitute the United States as a leading power in the world, exploiting the field of crisis of the United States, or the European Union wanted just to search for more autonomy but recognizing the leading role and of the United States at the global level.
Okay. Yeah. We have 3 minutes each. 2 minutes each.
You want to go first? Or do you-
No.
Okay. I recall last night's conversation about an Italian word, dell'Italia. That's how I would describe EC stance and ambition in the 1970s. There was a gap between ambition and possibility to actually fulfill the goal that they had. But I would not say that EC purpose was to challenge the United States as leading power, definitely not in the 1970s, and I would not say that the EU wants to challenge the US even today. What they wanted was to gain and to manage their space of autonomy in a more in a more autonomous way, but it was not a challenge to the Western order at all.
To answer to your question, I agree on what you have said. Although I'm not sure that in 1973 there is a European policy toward the Middle East. I'm not an expert on that. But I think that after the oil shock there were some nationalistic answers, responses to that. No. Let's think about Andreotti, which travels in Middle East, trying to have contracts for Italian firms. I'm not so sure that it is so coordinated in Europe. And the French did the same. And I'm not so sure that there was such a real huge coordination when hard currency and hard problems were on the table. But I think
Experts
that
are down there, and I think
but
in the
I think
afternoon
that in the afternoon someone will contradict
Yeah.
me.
Okay. The nature of the agreement. The cooperation agreement was more or less belonged to the framework of the other agreements signed within the global Mediterranean policy, but it was never called a Mediterranean kind of agreement, but it was a sui generis agreement, because this way Yugoslavia's formal independence and non-aligned position could be respected. But when the agreement was signed, Lorenzo Natali, who was commissioner for, I don't remember what exactly, Natali for external relations, or anyway, he described the cooperation agreement between Yugoslavia and the EC as a model for future agreements with other Mediterranean countries. And it was different from other trade agreements. One, for several reasons, I just mentioned one, is that the perspective of membership was never present. So it was clear that for several reasons, first of all, the Cold War framework, Yugoslavia's membership in the EC was never discussed. And also association with the EC was never discussed. First time in 1989, about just 3 weeks after the fall of the Berlin Wall. There was, of course, debate about Yugoslavia's integrity, and I did not make research on German archives. I just read the published documents in the collection of published diplomatic documents until 1980, and there you can find that there is interest in Yugoslavia's integrity and stability. There are, of course, positions against financial aid to Yugoslavia, and also for the question about social rights of Yugoslav workers in Germany. in Western Germany. But they concerned, from my point of view, just economic issues, but the principle of Yugoslavian stability and integrity was shared among the 9 and the 10 after 12.
Okay, so we are now going for lunch. Thanks for attending this very interesting panel, and I invite you to join me in an applause for our 3 panelists.